The Radical. Fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, everybody, welcome and thank you for joining us today on the Yaron Brook Show. And I know it's a little later than I usually do the shows, but it's been a crazy day today. So I was considering not doing a show, but I promised. So here I am. We're going to do a show. We're going to do it on, an easy topic, so I can just do it off the cuff. And that is, what makes socialism so evil? What's wrong with socialism? Why do I view socialism as so bad? And I mean, it occurred to me that it's worth doing this show because, for a number of reasons. Well, one was, I put out this the show where I critiqued Bernie Sanders' appearance on Joe Rogan's show. And it's amazing. It is amazing how many people have actually watched that episode. So it's massively being watched, and the comments are overwhelmingly negative. So which is great because it means that most of the people watching it are Bernie fans. So I'm getting lots of thumbs down. So if you can, go to that show, give us a thumbs up, just so my stats don't look too bad. But lots of thumbs down from Bernie people. But what's also happening is my subscriptions are going up. So, a lot of people not exposed to these ideas are being exposed to them. Some of them are hating it, but some of them maybe, hope, it's causing them to think. But anyway, some of the complaints about the show, right, in a sense, I take too much for granted when I criticize Bernie Sanders. For somebody who is not familiar with my arguments, that is, I assume on the show too much that you guys know where I'm coming from, and therefore I think for a lot of people when I criticize, let's say social medicine and stuff like that, I think all the arguments I made are valid, but it's out of left field for them, and it's really difficult for them to really get it because they don't understand the context of what we're actually talking about, what I'm actually talking about, and the context they're missing. They get it from the instances I bring out, but not explicitly, is really the moral content, the philosophical content. Because the reason socialism is wrong, the reason socialism is evil, the reason socialism is something you want to avoid, is not primarily because, or not only because it doesn't work. I mean, to me, well, of course it doesn't work. It's obvious it doesn't work. Because fundamentally it's immoral. It's detached from reality. It's detached from human nature. It has a bad perspective on human nature. So if you take on, so what I want to do today is really talking about that. Rather than talk about, well, the Canadian healthcare system is not as good as the Americans and da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and all the concretes, and look what happened in Soviet Union, look what happened in communist China. Look at, and then they come back with, what about Norway, and what about Sweden, and all this stuff. Let's talk a minute about what socialism is. That seems to always be missing from the debate. And, they don't define their terms. Nobody defines their terms. Bernie Sanders doesn't define his terms. He takes it all for granted. And what are the foundational ideas on which it is based? On which it is based. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about what is socialism, what are the philosophical ideas on which it's based, why are those philosophical ideas evil, and since they are evil, well, then socialism's evil, and its outcome is always negative. That is, the outcome is always harmful. A few rules of the game. Super chat questions Off topic, I will get to at the end of the show. You can ask them, but I will get to the end of the show. So Jason has already asked a question completely off topic. I will get to it at the end of the show, so you're going to have to stick around. If you want me to see your question, then you have to use the super chat. If you want to make a comment, you have to use the super chat. Those are the only things that I typically, I cheat sometimes, but I typically respond to. The super chat, partially to incentivize you to support the show with a few bucks here and there. And if you want your super chat question to be answered quickly, then make it on the topic. And again, if you have show suggestions, if you have suggestions of things I should be doing, then I think the best way to do that, again, is a super chat. I might catch it in the comment, but I can't read every comment. There's no way I can do that and talk. And I have comments from YouTube, and I have comments from Facebook, and I have to keep track of all of that. Of course, YouTube, you're stuck. You can't ask questions. Facebook, you can't ask questions on Facebook. If you want to ask questions, you have to move to YouTube and set up a super chat facility. So super chat allows me to screen down the questions and only answer the questions from people who are really interested in having them answered. It keeps the trolls, if you will, out. And it also allows for some support for the show. So I appreciate all of you participating in the super chat feature. All right, so what is socialism? Socialism is the multiple, I've looked at dictionaries, they all have different definitions, but they're all about the same, particularly socialism as it's always been understood versus how I think what they call today democratic socialism, they're trying to shift it around and change it. But basically, socialism is a political and economic system of social organization which advocates, and I'm reading from a dictionary online, it advocates that the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned or regulated is a modern way of saying it, by the community as a whole, or by the state, or, if you want to use Marxist terms, by the workers. So socialism is a social, political, economic system that advocates that the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned by the state, the community, the workers, right? In various interpretations of that. And of course, under democratic socialism, what they argue is, well, we don't own all the means of production. We have a little bit of capitalism, we have a little bit of markets in there. We don't own all the means of production, but at the end of the day, through the democratic process, voters get to make economic decisions and get to dictate resource allocation, ownership, production, what gets produced, what doesn't get produced. So in the end, it's through the political system, through voting, the means of production get determined, even if there is a pretense of private ownership, that private ownership owns it, but through regulations and control. And that's kind of a blend of socialism and fascism, because fascism, most people think of fascism as primarily racist, but fascism is not primarily racist. Fascism, in its original theory, is this control over the means of production, through the use of the state, through the use of regulation, while leaving people with the pretense of private property. Right? So socialism fundamentally is about collective control, collective ownership of the means of production, of economic activity, any kind of economic activity. Socialism fundamentally is about the group making decisions by, idealistically, from their perspective, democratically. So, some socialist idealists will say, well, the way factories or the way businesses should be run is democratically. And I've mentioned Ayn Rand has a great illustration of how well that works in Atlas Shrugged, where she has 21st Century Motors basically turned to that form of managing a business where everything is voted on. That could be, it could be through the state, it could be, like with democratic socialism, some mixture, and we allow markets some places, but the mixture is determined in the end by voters, by a democratic process, by majority rule, by the majority dictating. And of course, Marx's whole view is different, because with Marx's view, the majority didn't matter. It was not about democracy. It was about what was good for the proletarian, and socialism is a phase that you go through on the way to pure communism, but it's not a democratic phase. There's no democracy in Marx. There's no importance for democracy. It's the will of the proletarian must be, that is what must be fulfilled. And if the proletarian are not the majority, then tough, because it's the proletarian that are going to dictate. They're going to dictate what happens in a kind of a Marxist socialist. And the term socialism predates Marx. I think I've seen the date as being 1830. Somebody asked, I think people, Bernie, conflate expanded welfare programs with socialism. They don't really mean government control of the means of production. Well, but they do, right? So certainly the emphasis in modern times, and we'll get to why that is, the emphasis in modern times with regard to socialism is the welfare state, is welfare programs and expansion of the welfare state, a dramatic expansion of welfare programs. The Scandinavian kind of model where, a very, very generous and a large percentage of GDP is spent on redistribution of wealth and a reduction of income or wealth inequality. But of course, they also want to control the means of production. Now, not to the extent that maybe old-line socialists used to, not to the extent of owning the means of production. But I don't think Bernie Sanders, when he gets into, if he ever wins the presidency, is about deregulating business because we socialists, we don't want to control the means of production. Quite the contrary. Bernie Sanders wants to increase regulations, increase controls. He doesn't quite argue for nationalizing the banks, which used to be very popular among socialists maybe 30 years ago. But he certainly wants to regulate them so much that they could be the equivalent of owned by the state. So this idea that they don't want to control the means of production is blatantly false. They want to control the means of production. They might not want to technically own the means of production. They want to find the right balance where they can use the means of production from their perspective optimally by giving just enough freedom to the entrepreneur and the businessman to create just enough wealth so they can tax just enough of it so that they can have their welfare state. But of course they want to control business. They want to control what products are built and how they're built and how much employees are paid. I mean, minimum wage is not a part of the welfare state. It's a part of controlling the means of production. So yes, again, they don't own the means of production, but they're clearly controlling them. So no, socialism is very much about, even today, even among the Bernie Sanders fans, about not just a dramatically expanded welfare state, but a dramatically expanded control of business, control of the means of production and the distribution of production, and and trade generally, right? If Bernie had his way, he's told us he wants a transaction tax on all stock dealings. He wants much more regulation of financial industry, a much higher minimum wage, which was regulation on labor. He wants the government to intercede everywhere where there's economic activity. So no, Bernie is no different in any fundamental sense than what you would consider traditional socialists. The fact that he puts in democratic socialism in front of it makes no real difference. It's just a trick. What they want you to think, oh, we're a little less rigid in our socialism. but they're not really. So let's talk a little bit about, so what does this actually mean? What is the essential characteristic of socialism? I mean, the essential characteristic is that it's a political, social, economic theory that places the group primarily in the realm of the material, because that's what interests socialists, the material realm, wealth and wealth creation and economic activity. It places the interests of the group vis-a-vis economics as primary. And it is a system that advocates the negation of any kind of individual right, individual sovereignty over their own activity, over their own production, over their own distribution, exchange, trade. Individuals don't matter. And this is the fundamental idea behind socialism. Individuals don't matter, other than in what they contribute or sacrifice to the group. The only thing that matters is the collective. The only thing that matters is the group. Individuals are meaningless. Individuals can be sacrificed. Individuals can be treated unequally. Individuals can have their property taken away, because property, there is no such thing really as individual property under socialism. Everything is collectivized. Socialism is the idea of, the value of collectivization and the negation of the individual. So you cannot separate. Socialism is a form of collectivism. And collectivism is saying that the group, however you define that group, is superior to the individual. And for the sake of the group's well-being, individuals can be sacrificed. So let's take healthcare, for example, right? Healthcare, for example. So socialized healthcare, that's a big issue for Bernie Sanders. It's a big issue that comes up anytime we discuss socialism or discuss economics or discuss politics. It's an issue that when I discussed it on my show on Bernie Sanders, all these people flipped out about. Well, let's take healthcare. So the idea with nationalizing the healthcare system, which was what socialized or Medicare for all is, it's nationalizing. It's not just increasing the welfare state. It's government control over the means of production, because that's what it means. It's government control over doctors, government control over hospitals, government control over what treatment you get and what treatment you don't get, government control over every exchange, because they set the price, right? You don't set the price with the doctor. They set the price with the doctor. You get it for so-called free, right? It's government control over every aspect of the means of production of healthcare. For what aim? Well, for improving the healthcare of society. But I would say, right, and many would say, but my healthcare treatment is great. I actually have the best healthcare in the world. I have fantastic doctors. I pay them well. I have amazing hospitals. I got 2 MRIs a couple of weeks ago within a couple of days, and my insurance paid for it, and I had some out-of-pocket expenses, but they weren't too bad, and the MRI machine was state-of-the-art, and it was amazing, and then I went to see a specialist, and the specialist, did what he had to do. I have amazing healthcare. Now, I truly believe that it could be much better and could be much cheaper. So I'm not saying this is the pinnacle of possible health cares. But I have pretty damn good health care. And if I go to the people advocating for Medicare for all, and I say, but my health care is great, they would say, it doesn't matter. You are just one individual. And by the way, you're an individual who has money. You're an individual who can afford health insurance. By the way, 90% of Americans can afford health insurance, but put that aside, and have a health insurance. But put that aside, you don't count. What counts is the group. Now, when you boil down, what does the group mean? Because that's the next step, right? Who do the socialists care about? Because, yeah, I mean, to some extent, the socialists care about the majority. Majority will. But what does the majority care about? What really gets people revved up? What really gets people excited? What gets people excited about socialized healthcare, even though I would argue that most of the people who are going to vote for it will actually land up with worse healthcare than they have today. But they'll vote for it. Why? What gets them excited? Is it the argument? Do you hear a lot of the argument, well, society will be better off? At the end of the day, no. At the end of the day, you don't hear that argument. That's not how it's phrased. That's not how this form of collectivism is presented. What do you hear? Well, what about the poor? And the uninsured? And the people who get lousy health care today? What about them? So, take socialism, take the collectivism of socialism, social well-being, and we don't have a standard for determining what's good for society. How do we figure out? Because, I mean, if you did like a utilitarian game, right? If we pretended utilitarian could be calculated, right? And you looked at the healthcare Americans get today, people who have insurance, and you look at the quality they get, right? Taking out the uninsured, taking out people on Medicaid, taking out people who clearly get lousy health care, which is Medicaid and the uninsured. You take those out, you take the vast majority of Americans, and you add up all the utilities that they get out of this fantastic health care. And then you give zero utility value, all this is BS, but let's play the game. And you give a zero utility value to the people who are getting lousy health care. Let's say they get zero. And you add it all up, and you add that up to a number. And then you switch to socialized health care where everybody gets worse health care, but those 10% who are uninsured and the people who get Medicaid get better health care. Then that average, I would imagine, just thinking about it, and I could prove it because I could prove what would happen under socialized medicine in the United States, would be much, much, much lower. Now, nobody does that exercise. Nobody can do that exercise. That exercise is impossible to do as I phrased it. So nobody talks that way, and if they did, they'd lose everybody. Right? So what do? They latch on to what morally makes this collectivism possible, which is altruism. Altruism is not being nice to people. Altruism is not opening doors to old ladies or giving your seat to a pregnant woman on a bus. Although I guess that could be viewed as sexist these days. And I don't know. Can you even tell that it's a woman? What gender exactly are they? And put that aside. So you don't do that. What altruism actually means is to live for the sake of others. It's the primacy of other people's well-being over your own. Altruism really means being selfless. That is an essential part of altruism, and that's why, arguably nobody is a pure altruist. But altruism infects everything in our world. Because it says to be good, to be moral, to be virtuous, means to sacrifice for others, means to give up stuff that you value for other people's well-being. It means never to think about yourself, never to think about your own well-being, never to place any real value on that. Now, we all do, but then we're expected to feel guilty about it. And we do. Most older Americans, successful older Americans that I meet, feel guilty about their success. They, again, won't necessarily admit it, but they do. Because altruism demands it. How did you get successful? You thought too much about yourself. Now, if I've got really good health care today, and somebody says, yeah, but those people don't, and I say, yeah, my health care is great, they're not my problem. Oh my God. All hell breaks loose. Right? I mean, you're being a selfish bastard. You only care about yourself. And if you propose something like, well, in a free market healthcare system, most of them would be able to afford healthcare because insurance rates would drop, and how do you know that? And isn't that a system based on, self-interest? And what about those who can't afford healthcare even under that system? Well, they would have to rely on charity, or they won't get healthcare. Oh, well, that's outrageous. You mean rely on charity, rely on a goodwill of people? We don't believe in that. People won't be charitable, particularly not in your world, because they're self-interested. I mean, any path you take to criticizing national health care, for example, leads you down a road of having to go after altruism and having you have to defend self-interest. And there's no other way to do it. And of course, since the culture is so immersed in altruism, well, most people think, well, okay, so my healthcare will be a little worse, but those people over there will be okay, and I'll be able to sleep at night. I'll be able to feel good about myself. And yes, there's a pain threshold at which it will be so bad that people stop caring about those other people. But we live in a pretty rich society in which, for the most part, we just don't consider that. We just don't consider that. We think, it'll be good enough. Good enough. Plus, one of the big distortions when it comes to healthcare is Medicare. Everybody says Medicare for all, and you assume, well, first of all, Medicare today has a lot of private insurance associated with it, and Bernie Sanders would exclude that. That would all be gone. So what makes Medicare pretty good is the fact that it has private insurance. But what really makes Medicare pretty good is that it's unlimited spending. The government just spends and spends and spends. If you're sick and you're an old person, they'll just spend money on you. And of course, that cannot continue forever, in spite of what the modern monetary theory economists will tell you. You cannot just print money and spend it forever. So, at some point you have to ration, you have to control, you have to limit, you have to reduce the quality and the extent of the healthcare you're providing. So Medicare is a fallacy because people look at it today, but even when it only deals with people over 65 and they say, wow, but even that is not sustainable. And everybody knows it's not sustainable. But now they want to expand it to include everybody. Well, that is ridiculously not sustainable. But again, nobody cares. So we have to sacrifice a little bit for the sake of, it's not even the common good in the end, because the common good, if the common good is measured by numbers, and I hate that term, right, because it doesn't mean anything. But if it's measured by numbers, then then the system we have today is better than Medicare for all. And a system of pure capitalism is clearly better than what we have today. But it's not presented that way. We have to suffer, we have to sacrifice for the poor, we have to sacrifice for those in need. I mean, socialism at the end of the day is a political system built on the idea, political, social, economic system built on the idea that everything must be geared towards the needy, at least modern socialism, not Marxist view. I think Marx was pretty ruthless about some people. To Marxists, everything was geared towards the proletarian, but the whole idea of the proletarian has lost much of its meaning in modern society. So basically what's replaced the proletarian is the needy. And the needy includes, it turns out, if you look at Scandinavian countries, most of us need something. Most of us don't want to rely on ourselves. Most of us are afraid that we might not be able to afford X, Y, or Z. And most of us, ultimately, are willing to accept a welfare state even if it includes us, even if it hurts us, because it helps those needy. Socialism in modern day is 100% geared towards needy from a welfare perspective. And from a control of the economy perspective, it is geared 100% towards suppressing and controlling self-interest, controlling profit, suppressing profit, denying businessmen, entrepreneurs, the ability to run their business. Again, running it in a way that, quote, helps the needy, minimum wage laws, and so on. People who can't take care of themselves, so, you have to now have 1 million regulations that are supposedly protecting you, the needy, from toys that might not be good, or from, 1 million, from food that you might get poisoned. Again, not trusting the self-interested motive to provide good food, and not trusting the fact that people can think for themselves, and we'll get to thinking for themselves in a minute. It's substituting the judgment, the intelligence, the ability of the bureaucrat and of the majority for the individual. So, individual doesn't matter. His role is to sacrifice to the needy, and what the needy need, and how we can make sure the individual kind of, in a sense, produces the most, so we can take the most, so we can provide the most for the needy, is we give that to the bureaucrats, and we regulate that through democracy. But the enemy of socialism, this is what makes it evil, is the individual. The enemy of socialism is individual judgment. The enemy of socialism is independence, the virtue of independence. The idea that you can judge for yourself, that you can be an independent person materially and as an independent thinker. Socialism categorizes you either as somebody who must be sacrificed to the needy, which is a group that grows ever more, because it's easy to grow, right? Think about it. There's a group over there that's really, really poor, and they're really, really needy, and they don't have anything. And we can all agree they're really, really on the verge of dying of starvation. And we give them a little bit so that they no longer on the verge of dying of starvation. They're a little bit better than that. But then they don't have iPhones, or they don't have a home, or they don't have a good job, or they're just barely getting by. Now, that becomes a need. An iPhone becomes a need. A good job becomes a need. Having a home becomes a need. And then, okay, now they've got an okay home. Now they've got an okay job, and they might even have an iPhone. But they're not getting world-class health care. And they can't afford, I don't know, to go to the movies 5 times a week or whatever the next thing is. And then the needy grows and grows. And in most modern social welfare societies, we have now turned 50% of the population into the needy. Right? The middle class now needs government help. They can't get to that next level without some. And then you've got the sacrificers, the people who need to be sacrificed in order to fill the needs. So socialism categorizes people in those two bases. Those to be sacrificed and those who are the beneficiaries of the sacrifice. The individual is irrelevant, and the standard of the sacrifice is altruism. And the standard of regulating and control is a deep distrust, hatred of anything that smacks of self-interest. And by that standard, you could argue America is already socialist in many ways. Our banking system is already controlled by the government. Most of our industries are controlled by government. And government is interfering in all of our activities, and any sense of self-interest they try to crush. And certainly people who call themselves social democrats are completely committed to this. And of course, we have massive redistribution today. Massive redistribution of wealth. And we've got basically 50% people being sacrificed for 50% who are some recipients of sacrifice. Of course, if you understand the impact of these kind of policies and the impact of socialism, we're all being sacrificed for nothing. But that is always the case. What was the purpose of, in Lenin's word, breaking some eggs, i.e. killing a bunch of people for the sake of the future of communism? Well, for nothing, because the future of communism was nothing. It was death and destruction, and that was it. There was no end beyond that. And we're not being sacrificed for anything. Indeed, everybody who is virtuous, everybody who's willing to work for a living, everybody who's willing to be an independent individual is better off without all of this, without socialism in our government. So in that sense, everybody's being sacrificed. But of course, unfortunately, a majority of people are being convinced that this is the right morality, the right ethics, that they should not trust anybody pursuing their self-interest, and they should be willing to sacrifice for anybody who's needy, and that since they probably wouldn't sacrifice out of their own, call it free will, well, not just call it, out of their own free will, they have to be forced to sacrifice, and they're okay with that. Because that's the way of the world. What choice do we have? I mean, you got to have taxes. You got to pay for government somehow. So, you know, some force, a little bit more force, a little bit less force, but it's always force. Force is okay. And since the individual doesn't matter for socialists, force against the individual is fine. And often the force is justified in the form of, well, we know better what's good for you. We're not really interested in what's good for you because we're interested in social well-being. But we also happen to know what's good for you. So what the socialists reject is individual sovereignty, but also what they reject is the individual capacity to reason and judge for himself. And they replace that with the collective wisdom of the group, or the collective wisdom of those in power, or the collective wisdom of the bureaucrats. Right. All right, a couple of questions relating to socialism. Socialism appeals to the resentment and frustrations of common people manifested in envy towards the successful. The state becomes their god. Yeah, but it's deeper than that. Again, why do they feel resentful? Right? I mean, just because they're common people? Why do they feel resentment? Where does the resentment come from? Where does envy come from? I mean, America, for about 100 years, I don't think that resentment existed. And I would argue that if you survey many of the immigrants who come to the United States today, they don't resent the successful. So where's that resentment coming from? The resentment comes from altruism. The resentment comes from the idea that the needy must be taken care of, and some of these people are needy by their definition. But even if they're not, altruism demands that the people who be sacrificed the most are those who are most self-interested. And the people who are most obviously self-interested are the business people, are the wealthy, are the successful. So the resentment is, why is that guy whose moral responsibility it is to take care of me and people even more in need than I am, how come he gets to drive in his fancy car and live in his fancy home? When his moral duty, and you can't take out this idea of moral duty, his moral duty is to help the poor, to help me. You do not have socialism without altruism. You do not have socialism without altruism. You do not have the resentment of wealth, other than from people who are just pure nihilists. You do not have the resentment of wealth in the scale that we have it today, without a moral foundation. That moral foundation is altruism. Altruism, this idea that the purpose of your life is to serve others, to sacrifice. The idea that self-sacrifice, giving up that which you value for that which you don't, is noble, it's good, it's wonderful, it's virtuous. And it doesn't matter if it's fake or real altruism. What does that even mean? Altruism is what people think is moral, whether they live it or not. But it affects their psyche. It affects the way they vote. It affects the way they think about successful people. Oh, he's successful. He's self-interested. Must be bad. He owes somebody something. They don't even think that in a sense of conscious thoughts. It's embedded in the culture. It's embedded in the way we view the world. So it's not that the common people out there, moral philosophers who've come to the conclusion altruism is their thing and they pursue. No, but it's part of the culture. It's who we admire in a culture, who we respect in a culture. I mean, the only place in which you find admiration and respect and awe towards success, in a broad sense, in a statist culture, is towards athletes, for some reason. So I think socialism appeals to the resentment, but one has to ask, why is the resentment there? And wasn't the resentment built on the same foundation that socialism was built? Both of them were built on collectivism, because who are you going to sacrifice to? Other individuals, autonomous beings with their own mind? No. You always sacrifice to a group. The only other alternative to sacrifice to is to a god or something like a god, to the state. But the state is just a group, right? So, absolutely I agree with the point about resentment, but, I agree to the point about resentment up to a point. If you look at all the young kids who love Bernie Sanders, they're not resentful. You don't get resentment from them. Most of them are rich kids. Most of them, parents are very successful. I mean, socialism is to a large extent a middle-class disease. It's a middle-class ideology. Not middle-class, actually. It's upper middle-class ideology. Rich kids are socialists. So, a lot of it's not about resentment. These kids that socialized healthcare and how can we be the only Western country that doesn't have socialized healthcare? This is a travesty. Young kids in their 20s, right? And you go, well, you're still in your parents' plan, but even if you left your parents' plan, you probably have a good job. You look like you could be a programmer or something like that, and you've probably got the best healthcare in the world. So what is the problem? And the problem is obvious, and I'll tell you what the problem is. But those people don't. That's not about resentment. That's purely about altruism. Purely about altruism. It's a placing of the interest of those people who don't above your own. It's the same thing I get in every talk I ever give about capitalism. But what about the poor? Well, what about them? Who are they? Well, which poor? What poor? Right? But why is that your first question? It's a legitimate question at some point. But why is that the first question always? Because we're all conditioned by altruism to think about what's the most needy group and how will they survive? Well, no, that's not the standard of morality. Standard morality should be, what about the most virtuous group, the most productive group? And how will they survive? You want to build an economic system. You want to build a social system that is consistent with a moral way of life. And morality, for Ayn Rand, morality for me, is about pursuing your own long-term rational self-interest. Really about pursuing your self-interest, because long-term and rational is just what it means to be self-interested, what it means to have a self. You don't have a self in this moment that is irrespective of the future. So, it boils down to morality, not to just random resentment. And again, if you look at who is a socialist, that doesn't explain it. Okay. Healthcare, housing, and education are socialized because we acknowledge that we need them. Consumer goods like computers are treated as nice to haves and thus are allowed to have a free market. Well, Really? I mean, there's a sense in which you're right. That's people's perspective. But healthcare never used to be something we needed, because healthcare was something unusual and rare, and healthcare needed to be produced just like every other good. Needed to be created. We didn't know we needed it until it was produced. I mean, there were no hospitals and doctors 200 years ago. I mean, there were, but they were quacks, and they were meaningless. Healthcare, housing, education. Again, why do we need education more than we need a computer right now? I mean, the whole concept of need in this context is bogus. I mean, we need whatever we needed right now. I mean, I couldn't do what I do right now without a computer. I need a computer. That some person hasn't decided, that people in power hasn't decided, Bernie Sanders hasn't decided that to have a policy of computers for all, but he has got a policy of computers for all. Well, not exactly computers for all, but it's called high-speed bandwidth for all. That's a need. I mean, you think way too narrowly, right? We all have a need for high-speed internet, which means we all have a need. So the government is going to invest huge amounts of money to make sure everybody in every neighborhood, including in rural places, has high-speed internet, and they view that as a right. In Europe, it's certainly listed as one of the rights. And you could go on and on and on about the way in which, when somebody like Bernie Sanders says a living wage, does a living wage include buying a computer? I think it does. I don't think it just means a simple house, and basic, basic food and just surviving. It means, living a modern life with all the needs that a modern life has. So again, I think it's thinking about it too simplistically. There's no limit to human needs. And therefore there's no limit to, right now they can get away with claiming that healthcare, housing, and education are needs, and bandwidth is a need, and there are a bunch of others. I mean, what's the whole point of having Freddie and Fannie and subsidizing mortgages and zoning laws and all this stuff, and requiring low-income housing being built and all this stuff? If housing, yeah, you said housing is a need. But you can imagine the needs just growing, and they do constantly grow. All right. And indeed, in America, housing has been less nationalized than has been healthcare and education. Why? I think it has more to do with history than anything else, in terms of what industries are nationalized and what aren't, and where the results are so obviously bad. I mean, a lot of times, in the past, one of the first things the socialists did was nationalize banks. But that blew up in their faces so many times that they've stopped advocating for that. Now they want just to regulate and control banks. The best example of that is François Mitterrand, who came to power, I think, in around 1980 in France as president of France, and he was a socialist, ran on a socialist platform, and he nationalized the banks, literally. Stole them from the owners, made them government-owned. And within 2 or 3 years had to re-privatize them because it was such a disaster. And nobody's talked about nationalizing the banks since. Okay. I push the value of free market healthcare. It's very difficult with millennials now. Many assume you'll die without constant, expensive healthcare. I mean, they think the world's going to end anyway in 12 years. I don't know why they're focused on healthcare. Who the hell cares about healthcare? If the world really is going to end in 12 years, everything should be devoted to the Green New Deal, right? I mean, why is anything else even an issue? Because they can't even take themselves seriously. But yes, it's very hard for them to conceive of what healthcare means. They don't consume it much. They don't need it much, but they have these horror stories that they've been told, and that's another thing socialists and statists or demagogues generally do, is they find the horror stories and they emphasize those. They, see their grandparents may be needing a lot of health care, but they have no real first-hand experience necessarily of bad, bad health care being provided today. But they're relatively poor and they worry. But they all have jobs. Typically they have jobs and they're getting health care from their jobs and they're fine. But it's this projection, this altruistic projection. And it fundamental, and you can't underestimate how deep this goes. Really, really, really deep. They fundamentally, deeply distrust self-interest. So what do you mean private health care? You mean people would run them for profit? They would run them for their own self-interest? I mean, that's impossible. The disasters that would happen. I mean, it would be like the financial crisis, just in healthcare, so it would be 1,000 times worse. And part of that is the lousy defense the pro-capitalists have done in defending capitalism. Have allowed capitalism to be smeared, have allowed capitalism to be blamed for all the problems, all the crises that have happened. But it's primarily the fault of the moralists, the moral philosophers, the moralists who have failed to defend self-interest because they don't believe in it. But the number one thing, if you want capitalism and you hate socialism, if you want free market healthcare, the thing you have to defend more than anything else, not the mechanism of a private market. They don't care about that. The thing you have to defend is self-interest. And to do that, you have to defend the efficacy of reason, the idea that as individuals, we can actually manage the world out there. Our reason is, efficacious. It allows us to deal with the world effectively so we can pursue our own self-interest. And then that it's morally right to pursue your own self-interest. That the purpose of life is your own well-being and your own happiness and your own success in life. That's the purpose of life. The purpose of life is to succeed at life. And to do that, then you need to be free. That's ultimately the argument against socialism. Socialism is anti-freedom. I mean, that argument about the importance of freedom. You can't take freedom for granted. And freedom, of course, means for us the absence of coercion in our pursuit of our own rational self-interest, in a pursuit of our own rational values. Capitalism, freedom, political freedom is the only system that allows us to be selfish. Leaves us alone to be selfish. Provides us with a legal framework to act, live selfishly. That's what needs to be defended. And this is why libertarians fail. Because they refuse to do that. They refuse to get into morality, or worse, they use the morality of altruism or they use utilitarianism to try to justify their ideas. Whoops, do we lose the link to Facebook? Are you still there, Facebook? Don't know what happened there. All right, let's see. Bernie always blames corporations for cronyism, but never the politicians accepting the bribe. Do you think he views politicians as virtuous? I think he does view politicians and bureaucrats as virtuous. But more importantly, and goes to exactly the point I was just making, he views corporations as inherently evil. Inherently evil. Why? Because they're inherently selfish. Because they're inherently pursuing self-interest. They're inherently pursuing profits. So it doesn't matter what he thinks about politicians. What he knows and what his followers knows and what unfortunately, a growing number of Americans know is that corporations, business, profit is bad. And they know it because they've been guided implicitly by altruism that tells them that being self-interested is evil. That you should be selfless. That is the whole point of life. Selflessness. All right, we lost Facebook. Go figure why. I don't know. But we're still on YouTube, still going strong on YouTube. So that's why he blames corporations. It's not that he has a positive view of politicians, bureaucrats, as much as he has the negative view. Okay, somebody says I should get a Corona and some fried platanus. Yeah, I mean, I don't drink beer, so Coronas are out. I love fried platanus, so yes, maybe I'll do that when this is over. Maybe I'll go downstairs and get myself some fried platanus. I'm kind of hungry. All right, some random questions unrelated to socialism. How is introspection a legitimate argument for free will? Science isn't done through introspection. Well, yes, it is. The science of psychology, of human knowledge of oneself, but also free will is not a scientific question. Not a scientific question in the sense that you mean it. That is observing outside there the way the material world acts. Free will is a question of observing inside our minds how non-material acts, how our consciousness acts. Our consciousness is not material. It might be a consequence of material, but our consciousness is not material. So, in observing something non-material is going to be very different than observing something material. And by the way, when I say non-material, I'm not talking about mysticism or anything like that. Your consciousness is not material. You experience things. I experience my surrounding right now. I experience passion. I'm experiencing emotion. That's not pure material. The chemicals going on in my body are not my consciousness. And I know I'm conscious. Not because I know scientifically, in a sense of, we understand how consciousness works. We don't. And certainly don't understand how human consciousness works. So you have to apply the appropriate tools to the appropriate question. And when the question is about how your cognition functions, how your mind functions, you have to introspect. Or if I asked you, why are you depressed right now? Why are you depressed right now? Is there a scientific reason why you're depressed right now? I mean, yes, science, there is, in a sense that if science is studying, the truth or applying a particular methodology to studying the truth, then there's a particular methodology in psychology to define why you're depressed. And the only way to discover that is for you to look inside yourself and to figure stuff out about yourself, to use introspection. There's a lot more to say about that, and I'm going to leave that to the philosophers to talk about. But free will is not a question for science. Free will is a question for philosophy. Free will is directly observable, and it's like the idea that existence exists. A is A. Aristotle's. That's not a scientific question. Does existence exist? You can't have science until you've already, in a sense, identified that existence exists. Then science is applied to discovering the exact nature of existence. You can't have a science of cognition. You can't have a science of the mind. You can't have a science of the brain until you actually can say consciousness exists. and free will exist. Those are your starting points. That's why they're axiomatic concepts. They're starting points. And you can't have a science of mind until you acknowledge that. And implicitly, the entire field of psychology, implicitly the entire field of, I think, ultimately even neuroscience and studying the mind, implicit in all of that is free will and a consciousness. All right. What caused the recession? I don't know which recession you're talking about. So I don't know who asked that question, but if you can tell me which recession you're asking about, I'd be happy to answer. I don't know if you're still on. It's Producer Chris. Producer Chris. If you're still on, tell me what recession it was. I got one more question. Two more questions. Anarchists argue with libertarians. Actually, three more questions. I missed this one. Anarchists argue with libertarians. I hate anarchy questions, just so you know, in general. Anarchists argue with libertarians. They say we don't need the military. Instead, we should just hire contact mercenaries. What do you think? Well, who is going to hire the contact mercenaries? Who is we? Are you going to hire them? And I'm going to hire mine? And who's going to decide when to deploy them and where to deploy them? And what if I disagree with you about where and how to deploy them? Are we going to go to war over that? Yeah, I mean, that's what anarchy means. Anarchy means a war of all against all. And anarchy is an unstable equilibrium, so anarchy almost always, very quickly, I think, in modern times, devolves into authoritarianism or totalitarianism. Because it's a theory, it's a social system that legitimizes force. It makes force, it says force is legitimate. And what happens when you legitimize force in society is that the person who has the ability and willingness to deploy the most force ultimately controls everything. Ultimately controls everything. So, I mean, it's just silly. I mean, the whole thing is really, 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 silliness. The whole anarchy thing I find just ridiculous. The arguments, I mean, I'm sorry if I'm insulting some of you anarchists, but really, I mean, think it through. Actually think it through. Don't just take David Friedman or Hoppe Hoppe is a complete, hack. But don't take David Friedman, who's at least not a hack like Hoppe is, and a racist hack on top of that. Don't take their word. Don't take Rothbard's word for it. Think it through. I mean, don't waste your time with Herman Hoppe. I mean, there's a lot of people that you might learn something from, but he is a real scoundrel. Real scoundrel. All right, still waiting to hear what the recession was. I don't see Producer Chris coming back and letting me know, so hopefully he'll ask another time. All right, that's the anarchist. I mean, I could say a lot more about anarchists. How do you deploy force? When do you deploy force? Who determines when you deploy force? How do you get any objectivity around that? I mean, there is really, really importance to having an objective, an agency responsible for the objective deployment of force that has criteria of when force is deployed. And you can't have competition around that, again, over the same geographic area. Citizens of the same place cannot, I mean, what do disputes among them mean? They mean going to war. All right. Do you think children tend to be selfish, but then adults knock them out of it? Well, it depends a little bit what you mean by selfish. I do think children tend towards what's good for them, what they think is good for them, or what they feel is good for them in the moment. Children cannot conceptualize very well. They can't think long term very well. They're very focused on instant gratification. Again, depending on the age group. They're inclined towards pursuing what is perceivably, or their best judgment, and I put judgment in quotes here, suggest is good for them. But they don't have the tools to be self-interested. That's why you need parents. That's why you need parents that tell children, no, you can't do that. No, that's not in your self-interest. That's not good for you. That won't enhance your life. Children will walk into the street because they want to get to the other side, and their self-interest supposedly dictates that they get to the other side right now, and they don't look for cars because they can't conceptualize that. So I wouldn't call it selfish in that sense. But yes, the tendency is towards that. So you did say tend towards. The tendency is toward that. And then I do think parents knock that tendency out because instead of teaching them how to think about how to be properly self-interested, instead of teaching children how to be properly selfish, what parents do is knock it out of them, is teach them how to be altruistic, even when they don't mean it. How to be altruistic in every regards. Think of others first. Think of other people constantly. Think of other people. That's the primary. And what they don't do is worse, the default. They don't teach them how to think about themselves. They don't teach them how to be selfish. And the most important thing to teach when you're teaching kids how to be selfish is to teach them how to reason, to teach them how to think. But to teach them the value of that, not just the technical side of it, but the value of it, why it's important. All right, if you watch the film Hombre with Paul Newman and briefly review it, I'll give you another $20. I've seen it years ago. I'll watch it and deal. I'll look it up and download it onto my iTunes. All right, let's see. Great Recession of 2018 was caused by government forcing and subsidizing banks to make bad loans. FDR, Carter, Clinton made these laws. Then Bush and Obama printed $4 trillion in QE money. Well, that's that recession. I'm not sure that's what he was asking about. And that's part of the explanation for the Great Recession. It also had to do with the Federal Reserve interest rates. It also had to do with the response of the Federal Reserve and government to the to the problems that were happening in the housing market. I've got a many-hour course on the recession, on the Great Recession of 2007-8. You can go look it up. It's in YouTube. It's for free. It's audio only, but it covers in great detail all of this. So. And by the way, those of you interested in the anarchy thing, there is on YouTube, you can find, if you search my channel, you will find a debate I did with a hoppe-loving anarchists in Poland. And you can see that debate. So rather than me doing a whole show about it, you can actually see the debate and see me going up against his arguments. So that is on my YouTube channel. Just put Yaron Brook Anarchy or something like that. It's pretty easy to find. It was done in Poland, I think last year. All right, good. I think that'll do it for tonight. It's getting late. Thank you. Thanks everybody, and I really appreciate you joining me this late at night. And the point I try to make today was that what makes socialism evil is its collectivism and its altruism. It's anti the individual. Was Ronald Reagan one of the good guys? Is the last question. Mixed. He gave a great speech, inspired a lot of people, did some good things in government deregulation, but also did some terrible things. The biggest evil Ronald Reagan did was to bring the religious right, the moral majority, the evangelicals into the Republican Party as the heart of the Republican Party. He destroyed the Republican Party, and we're seeing the consequence of that now. Plus, he never cut spending. And again, we're seeing the consequence of that. If Ronald Reagan didn't cut spending, what do we expect of Trump or anybody else? So those would be the negatives, off the top of my head, the negatives, and many others. All right, thanks everybody. Hope you enjoyed the show. I'll be back tomorrow hopefully at 8 o'clock p.m. Same place, same time. See you then. Bye, everybody.